So let's start on the main presentation of Spain. So to start with, I wanted to offer you two comparisons that were told to me that I think are fairly apt to think about Spain and think about Spain's wines and kind of put them in place for what may be our normal way of thinking about wines, or a normal thing. So if you start, the comparisons are both US to Spain. If you think about the United States and its wine growing regions, and maybe you start in Santa Barbara and think about how it's sunny all the time, move up to Napa where it's quite warm, go up to Oregon where it'll be cooler and rainy, go over to Washington State where it's an inland desert, maybe cross over to New York State and the Finger Lakes where it's fairly cool and continental. So if you think about all those wine growing regions in the US and just hold that in your mind for a second, and then maybe add in all of the non-growing wine regions that are part of the US, the swamps in Florida, the mountains in Montana, and take all of that thought and geography in the US and compress it down all into Texas. And that would actually be Spain. So Spain has enormous geographic diversity, has enormous climate diversity, and it's about as broad reaching in terms of climate and geography as the entire lower 48 states of the US. It just happens to be the size of Texas. So traveling a little ways in Spain can get you into a remarkably different region of Spain and a remarkably different climate and growing area as well. The other thing I'd have you think about is just think about the time frame that the US has been producing wine. Of course, the famous start is with Thomas Jefferson and producing wine in Virginia, but really commercial winemaking starts in the United States in the 1820s and 1860s in a serious way in California. So if you think that's maybe at most 200 years of serious winemaking in the United States, the history of Spanish winemaking actually starts with the Roman colonization. So it's almost 2,500 years of winemaking in Spain. So a vast difference of what's going on in Spain. And just I think the scale there in terms of time frame is interesting to relate to what we think about. So an amazing geography, but also an amazing history that goes with all of these wines. Now I wanted to start you with this Navajoreros wine for a couple of reasons. One is the grape type being Grenache, or Grenache as they would call it. Also the fact that it's from Madrid, and it gives us a little entrance into the DO system of Spain. And thinking about why this wine exists, and thinking about the history of Spanish wine for why this wine exists. So of course I already drew the map, but I'll highlight it here. Madrid, virtually in the middle of the country. And Madrid has its own DO. Now DO, I actually don't know the Spanish for it because I only ever have heard it as DO, but it's the geographic indication that matches the other European countries' geographic indication. So the same as the AOC system and DOC system that's in Italy and France. I don't know if they are going to roll, and in fact, I don't know if Italy and France are going to roll to a united EU system where we used to have the IGPs show up. So I haven't kept a brace of that. So DOs we'll go for here. Now, beyond the DO, just as just as Italy has a DOC and then a DOCG, Spain now has DOs and DOCs, and the C is a little c. When I checked the Oxford Companion yesterday and today, it was an older edition, but they said there were only two DOCs. Priorat has a system, and also Rioja has a system. Now, I can tell you, having been there, most producers I talked to did not reference the DOC or really had much interest in the DOC. The feeling I got from producers about the DOC system was that it was really being driven by wineries that were achieving very high price points in the export market, which would make sense that that would be Rioja and Priorat, as we'll see that those are some very expensive wines. Most producers I talked to did reference their DO because it had a fairly significant historical center to it, or a historical meaning to it. But most of them didn't reference it in terms of a legal designation or in terms of a farming designation or a yield designation. The DO matched what was the historic region for making wines, and so what you see on the label matches. So the DO system. Now, this wine, I think, is a beautiful one, and I hate to keep everyone dry, so let's take a taste of this. And it's our introduction to Grenache. And I think Grenache is a fun one. I know a long time ago at the wine bar, we kind of had a flight that was a experience of Grenache across different soils. We did Châteauneuf du Pape in Spain, and I think a US-based Grenache. But I think Grenache is a really interesting one because it can take a lot of heat in the vineyard. It can also be cropped fairly heavily in the vineyard. You can oak it quite a lot. It can also get fairly alcoholic. It can, if you let it go really far, amazingly enough, get tannic. Or you can do any kind of thing in between in terms of growing it and picking it to make it lighter, brighter, fresher, or darker, heavier, and full-bodied. So in a way, Grenache is a wonderful palate, a wonderful grape to show you the terroirs that go on. And especially a fun thing to do is see Grenache as it moves from south in Spain up into the north in the Priorat and then over into France. We're not going to cover France today, but it's a fascinating grape variety to see and have it express that. Now, again, here you're dealing with a fairly hot area, and this is a fairly ripe Grenache, therefore. The producer, on the other hand, wants you to have the full fruit expression of Grenache without anything covering it up. So they really want you to feel the purity of the fruit character of Grenache without having a lot of oak on it, without maximizing its concentration, so without getting it overripe, and also not using stems to it. And I've always found that this really does that, and in a fun way, really super does that, giving you that real strong raspberry character of Grenache, a little bit of spice to it, but then a full body weight, making it wonderful in this kind of season, just a big, bold drinking red, but still has some freshness to it as well. Now, if you look very closely at this label, it's a really fun one, and I'd love to get a t-shirt from the winery because it's got a bear on it, and then it's got a person riding the bear with a glass of wine in their hands. And that actually relates to the name of the winery and the winemaker. Yeah, it's very tiny, which is, I think, why they got it through the U.S. government, is because it's so tiny to actually see what's going on there. So my understanding is Navajoreros, and I don't speak Spanish, but the winery is, someone speak Spanish?
Right there.
Garcia. Oh, they don't put the winery name.
Bernavaleva.
Thank you. Say it again.
Bernavaleva.
Bernavaleva. Did I get it? Close enough?
I don't know about pronunciation.
Okay, sorry. If you want to spot it and see if you can see on the back. So yeah, I couldn't find it on the back, but Bernavaleva. So Berna, or bear, it is referring to the bear, hence the bear that they have on the label. The other part of that is they are actually up in a mountain range outside of Madrid, running along Mount Madrid over here, which is actually an ancient forest as well. So hence there were bears in the forest. And at one point a long time ago, it was settled by Celts. So there are Celt symbols and bears in the forest. And so this is an honor to that ancient past. So hence the name of the winery. And then the Camino is their entry-level Grenache. It's not really entry in terms of its flavor to me, but it's the start for the winery. For us as a sales team, I mentioned that because we do stock the higher tier one, and it does say the winery name on it. So if you're looking in POS and you're looking on the shelf, they look almost identical to one another, and they ring up almost identical. One is $5 more though, so you kind of have to be careful and look at it and think about it. Now, one of the reasons this Grenache is so pure and I think so wonderful is because it has very old vines to it. The vines were actually planted in 1923. And I tell you this because I think Spain has a couple of beautiful things going on with its vines that are important to know across the board. One is that Spain has a large amount of very old vines, and that relates to a couple historical things that went on. First, in Spanish history, I won't call it a gap, but there's a significant period of time when Franco, the dictator, ruled Spain. And if you're a dictator, you can put down rules, dictate rules to people. And a couple of rules that very strongly influence us and Spanish winemakers to this day is that the Spanish government was willing to buy, under Franco's dictatorship, was willing to buy any quantity of grapes anyone produced. So if you made grapes in any kind of capacity, the government would buy them, no matter what. You can see that this would mean that almost everyone would want to plant grapes and plant more of them. They also bought no matter what the tonnage. So it was an incentive to also crop grapes very, very heavy. So get to very high tonnage, and the government would buy it for you. To us, what this means is that to this day, Spain actually has the most acreage of any country in the world. And it's by far the most acreage of any country in the world. It also means that many of these vines are very old. Franco died in 1975 and the transition government came by 78. So still, if you're starting in 75 and going backwards, that means pretty much all of your vines are really, really old. With this particular property, they planted in 1923. Grandfather planted. He got wrapped up in the Civil War. Production at the winery stopped. They didn't rip out the vines because it would have been too much of a pain. The grandsons came back in the late 80s in the late 90s, and the grandsons started to revive the winery. One of the grandsons said it was too much work, so it's just one man running the show at this point, but he's now working with vines that are 90 plus years old.
How much of a government control on the way you make wine like they do in France do they have because of that?
That's an interesting question, and I heard no one talk about it there.
Mm-hmm.
So I suspect not as much as in France.
Mm-hmm.
And if other people know more, please interrupt. But I suspect not as much in France because no one talked about it.
Mm-hmm.
And then also there have been significant producers who we're going to discuss here who would have not fit into classical rules, yet are the benchmark for the region that we're in. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about Vega Sicilia and Pingus and Ribera del Duero, and then Clos Erasmus and Priorat. And those three would be significant producers that would not have fit a very structured and strict DO. So, okay. All right, so this guy giving us an introduction to old vines, Grenache in Spain, a little bit of history in Spain, and I think gorgeous drinking wine as well.
Can you visit the picture on the label? I wasn't familiar with the U.S. not bringing pictures on the label.
Yeah, I think you can't have for U.S. pictures, and it's the ATF that does it. This is a little bit of a sidetrack, but maybe you guys care, maybe not. This is actually the front label in the U.S. So the one that has the barcode and all the legal stuff and the alcohol, that's the front label in the U.S. to all wine bottles, not just this. You know, it's really odd. So this, technically, the U.S. doesn't care that much about. What they care about, though, is I think drinking and sexual organs. So if you make a reference to drinking or a reference to sexual organs on your label, they'll take that out. Yeah, so in the U.S., if you've ever seen...
Riding a bear.
Yeah, so if you're naked riding a bear with a glass of wine, that's you're out. That's encouraging drinking on top of bears in a forest that was planted by the
And
Celts.
we're all going to go do that.
Yeah, we're gonna do that. The one that's an example of that a lot of people know is Mary Edwards. Mary Edwards Sauvignon Blanc has a picture of a dancing woman, and she's, it's only in like whatever that covers up the important parts. So yeah, I don't think we have it here, but a fascinating one to look at is Weimar, Riesling and Gruner Veltliner from Austria. For some reason, he got a little man doing this on the label, naked.
Oh.
Yeah, and you can see, his member, but it's about that small.
Wow.
But if you look real close,
It met the specs for size.
yes, yeah. So, but that's
No one's
the,
going to get excited about that.
yeah. So that's
You're like,
that's
"Aw."
yeah, that's why. So teeny, but there. So.
Very weird.
That would be funnier if it had occurred in a third flight. So.
No, it's funny right now.
It's funny right now. Okay, good.
Yeah.
So.
It's funny talking about pink
Okay, I'll leave this area, but one thing I'll say is that this area, which is part of Navajoreros, where they're from, I was told was the hottest area in Spain internally, meaning that's an area where there's all kinds of new winemakers and winemaking. And I suspect that it's also an area where there's also all kinds of old vines, and the land is fairly cheap, and the grapes are fairly cheap. So as a new winemaker, you can come in and do all kinds of interesting things, and you're not having to mortgage your house away to do it. So I think you'll see more from this region, but this is one producer who is there. Okay, now let's go, and we're gonna go up to Green Spain, up here. And we're gonna journey to the DO of Ribiera Sacra. There. Now, this is Green Spain, and it's amazing to see, and I've done this class many times, but this is the first time that I've actually been there and seen it. But this area of Green Spain here is actually called Green Spain because it's green. And, you know, before I always thought of Man of La Mancha and Spain as kind of dry and dusty, and sort of conceptualized the whole country that way, which is why it's amazing to see the differences in person. But this area I was always told was green, in fact, meaning that it was actually growing green. And indeed, it is green. It's all the way green. It has trees, it has lush undergrowth. It's green and very different from the area of Madrid. The other thing that's interesting is in very ancient times, it was also settled historically differently than the rest of the country, and also kept a lot of that tradition. So to my amazement, this band, the Bay of Biscay and then facing the Atlantic, was actually settled by Celts, coming down from what would become the United Kingdom or England. And that just kind of in Ireland, and that just kind of blows me away that you would take what must have been, to my conception, primitive boats and being able to settle up in Green Spain. Especially because I think of Castellón and that, and Barcelona as Spain. So here, very different tradition in terms of the ancient sense. Also, this area of Spain is incredibly mountainous. And because of that, it was one of the last areas of Spain conquered by the Romans. It was also never conquered by the Moors, and it was eventually always part of the Kingdom of Spain and the Christian Kingdom of Spain. So it has a real interesting mix of Christian and Celt, but not Moorish. So very, very culturally interesting as well. And in fact, if you go to Ribera Sacra, and you can definitely see it and feel it, Ribiera Sacra is actually two rivers that come together. And these two rivers cut through a mountain range, which is mostly shale. And it's very, very steep elevations. And some of these vineyards grow at a 70% grade. Now, if you're thinking about trying to force a Roman army through that, it's basically an area where you can't build a road because it goes right down to the river. And you can't really send the army in the river because it's too narrow for boats. And then it's forested, so you can't really just hike your way through it real quickly either. And that would make it great for, of course, ambush. So a great way to keep out Romans is to have a geographic feature like that. For us, in terms of grape growing, it means that it's a very specific style of grape growing. And what I was told by one vintner, two things, and he meant them both seriously. One was we were about to go into his vineyard, and he said, "I'm really not trying to kill you." The second thing he said was that his grandfather always talked about heroic farming. So with the geographic feature of Ribiera, what you get on these steep slopes is terraces, and then planting in between the terraces. To illustrate that for you, a terrace in Ribera Sacra is maybe 4 feet wide, and then it's 7 feet tall to the next one. So it's above my head. So you get one line of vines, and then you get a 7-foot wall, and you get a next line of vines, and then you go up from there. Yeah, so if you think of like you've probably all walked in Napa Valley and been in some California vineyards. Yeah, if you think about them and then suddenly start shifting them row by row up 7 feet, it's pretty amazing style of farming. Cinque Terre is the same. And like in Cinque Terre, the method of harvesting is actually by small rail. So you have a small rail going down the slope, and you climb down by ladder, and then you pick, and then you put it on the small rail, just basically a chain system pulling it back up. So an incredible way of farming. Now, as you might guess, Ribiera Sacra, because of this way of farming, by and large, was fading off. Yes, there are vines there, and yes, there are old vines there, and yes, the government still bought these vines, but they were never very high yielding vines. And so, again, by and large, especially by the end of the Franco years when the subsidy went away, Ribiera Sacra was kind of going fallow. A couple of producers, this being one of them, came back to the area and decided to go for it and make a run of making the area something significant in terms of wine production again. So I forget the name of this winery. Guimaro, I understand, actually means rebel. It's one of the in their dialect, the word actually means rebels, so they named their winery Rebel for the reason of coming back to the winery, coming back to the family's vineyards to make wine. And the grape variety here is Mencia, or Mencia. Yeah. You can do, yeah, I think it's TH, but do whatever you feel comfortable with on that. So,
Let's see, tell us.
yeah.
Depends on what part of Spain you're from.
That's right.
Now, for a while, with my time with Mencia and Ribiera Sacra, it was thought that Mencia had some sort of relationship with Cabernet Franc. And I think that was kind of a little bit flavor driven. It has a little bit of the blue fruit character of Cabernet Franc, has a little bit of the aromatics of Cabernet Franc, a little bit of graphite, a little bit of the green note. And then on the palate, a little bit lighter in the mid palate, and then a little bit more taunt on the back palate. So the thought was that it was in some way related to Cabernet Franc. It was actually genetically proven by UC Davis that it's not. It has a relationship with the Portuguese grape variety, but otherwise it's distinct in and of itself. So it does not have a relation. This region is also now one of the hottest growing regions in Spain. I should qualify that. It's now become of significant interest to a lot of Spaniards and a lot of international markets. I can't claim it's the hottest in terms of production because they just don't produce a lot. But I do think you will see quite a few incredible Mencias coming from this region. And I think, amazing to me, the quality in the bottle is going to far outweigh the cost of the wine. And I think you'll see that. Now, the change there that you're going to see is Mencia as a grape variety under the Franco years was a heavy production variety. They were trying to produce more of it. But of course, that made fairly weak-willed wines. You can imagine if you took this wine and you poured, a quarter more water into it or half more water into it via high production, you're going to make a fairly weak, not fairly substantial wine. And then you don't oak it, and so it becomes really kind of something just watery and fresh. The wines I've tasted are much more significant like this one, not necessarily going for super dark concentration, but going for serious wine and also wine that can be very age-worthy as well. And I think this is on the road to that as well. I think this is a fascinating winemaker. This is their entry as well. They do have a series of other ones. The labels are identical. The POS system is almost identical for them. I don't think either store or all three stores, I don't think have any of the high tier ones. I think it's just this guy for us.
When you're talking age-worthy, I'm sorry,
No,
what are
please.
you saying? How long about?
I think wines like this are probably 5 to 7, but certainly producers with what's coming, I'm thinking that those are more like 10, 15-year wines. And just this, I think, is beautiful and has enough fruit, but going for much more significant wines.
More the higher tier than you.
Yeah. And I wouldn't say ultra ripe. I wouldn't say parkerized in any sense, but certainly looking around, thinking about the effort that they have to put in the vineyards, and thinking like, well, if we have to put in, X times 100 effort into the vineyards, really should we be making, this simple, easy drinking wine that achieves, X plus 2 price point? Let's go for something that reflects the quality of the terroir.
The Grenache as well, what would you say on that? Is age-worthy as well? Or, because Grenache, I think of Grenache as, very drinkable.
Yeah, I would say most Grenaches I would say are drink now. Yeah, and come and they're very fresh. And also they tend to not have much tannin. But we'll see, and let's revisit this question. We can revisit it when we hit Rioja because we'll have a little bit of Grenache, but then when we hit Priorat, let's revisit it again and
Okay.
think about Grenache and its companion grape varieties. So, okay. Any other questions? Go on to the home favorite, Del Ferrero.
No
Oh,
spit, none this
They-
one.
yeah, that's amazing. That smells great. Mm.
I'm not spitting.
Okay, so we're gonna go out to the coast.
Save the drinking for the
Out here. Now, before I went there, I always pronounced this as the region as Rishus Baixas. I swear on the bus trip, it's Rishus Bias. So whatever you guys choose, don't rely on me or go to some other Spanish translator. Yeah, it was on the bus trip and like 5 times trying to get, okay, is it Rishus Baixas or is it Biasis or, without the kind of TH sound in there. So, but I'll stick with Rishus Baixas for now, and it makes me sound like I know what I'm talking about if I just go forward for it.
Just fake it.
So here, this area, Rishus Baixas. One thing that's for certain is this is an area defined by its rias, or its fjords. So it's got these dramatic fjords going out to the Atlantic Ocean. And they are really dramatic. They're as dramatic as Norwegian fjords are. The other amazing thing is when you're out this far in Spain, you're actually beyond London in terms of heading west. And so we were out there, and it was last month, and it was 8:30 in the morning and it was pitch black. I mean, it's still on continental time, so it's on the same time zone as Budapest, which is, like that way by about 4 hours. And then London is farther this way, but sits in a different time zone. So to me, it was really discombobulating.
What are fjords? I don't know.
Fjords, they're rias.
Oh man!
Doesn't help. What are fjords? They are
Inlets.
cut inlets, but they're the reason that everyone references Norwegian fjords is because they're incredibly steep. Yeah, they're like mountains that jut out into the ocean. Yeah, and they're really dramatic, and these are that same way. So here with this, you get a very strong Celtic influence. And it's fun because that strong influence goes all the way from the wines to the food. So because you're up in the mountains, you're really not going to be farming a whole ton, although I have a slight explanation of that. So most of your food is going to come from the sea. And this is, if you want and you're willing to, this is where the world's most amazing cockles, razor clams, shellfish, all of them come from here. And we had amazing dinners with Albarino that were just those grilled with lemon. And that was it. And they were stunning. Yeah, it was absolutely stunning. The other thing that was amazing is that they can all of those. There's a very strong culture of canning those. So if you're exploratory and eating, getting fancy canned food from Rishus Baixas is wonderful as well. Yeah, it was absolutely wonderful. So here, with this style of farming, you get pergola vineyards. And pergola vineyards is a style of training vines. Pergola, instead of being the low or bush vine or trained in a trellis system, pergola actually go out to about 6 feet tall. They're on wooden stakes and trees, and they go up that far and then spread out. I was always told beforehand that they do that in this area because it's too cool to have them close to the ground because of the Atlantic influence. So getting them higher keeps away some of the frost. Now that may be true, but having just been there, what I was also told was the real reason for training in pergola is that you could get 2 crops. 1 crop up, which is your vineyard, and 1 crop down where you could grow other vegetables. And indeed, this was weird because I was, again, always told that it was very cool climate. It's the only place in the world where I've seen grapevines and corn growing together. Yeah, it was very weird driving through there, grapevines and corn. But you would definitely see underneath a crop of other, it was very strange. And of course, being from Iowa where there's lots of corn, you would never plant grapes. But, okay, so the grape here is Albarino, and the producer is Do Ferrero. We've sold Do Ferrero for many years, and I think this wine is just tremendous, and I think worth far more than its price point. Do Ferrero, as a vintner, has the documented claim of having the oldest grapevines in the world. He has documented 220-year-old grapevines, And that's what he makes this wine out of. I'll clarify that a bit. Those vines are on his vineyard, and if you punch into Google Do Ferreiro, Cepas Vias, the old vines, you'll see pictures of him standing next to pergola vines, and they look like giant pythons. They look like snakes climbing up, barely recognizable, because you really don't see any of the grapes or the leaves, just this giant old trunk of a grapevine heading up, and it looks like he's about to be eaten. So that's his Cepas Vias bottle, all old vines. It's a really significant bottle of Albarino. It's very structured, it's very intense. We do get it here. In a way, I find this one certainly more charming and more upfront and more expressive right away. If you're looking to age Albarino, which I have done, the Cepas Vias is an amazing one to age, but this one is just so delicious now that it's stunning. You know, to me, this has beautiful fruit character to it, but the thing I also like is that it has a sense of the place that it's from. The Atlantic Ocean is, of course, a salt water, and this to me always has a tang of saltiness to it. A good, nice, that again makes it fit incredibly well with food, but also makes you want to take the next drink of it as well.
And the next.
What would aged Albarino taste like?
And not fitting, you didn't see me
Yeah.
spit on that one.
on this one.
Yeah, no spitting. I've actually had a bunch of them old. There is a significant style in Albarino of doing skin or in Riches Baixas both, of doing lees aging Albarinos, and most producers do them now. Paso de Sonoras is one of the first. He was also one of the first. You basically lose some of the fun, perky freshness, and you gain a lot more complexity across the mid palate. So it becomes, it doesn't lose its acidity, but it becomes a weightier, more complex wine. And then as it ages, it gains in that complexity on the palate. Most producers who make an old one, or a longer aged one, it's significantly longer aged. Like I think Paso de Sonoras is 6 years older. So they are long aged Albarinos. Any other questions? All right, let's take the pause.